much for joining us, everyone here as well as everyone over at Mozilla. We are here for the next hour to talk about a talk by Nikhil Pahwa, who's one of the sort of leaders of the digital rights movement in India. It's called the Regulating the Internet's Future, like an overview of technology policy making in India. So what I thought I'd do is first just give an overview and introduce Nikhil to all of you and tell everyone about the great work that he's done in India. Also talk about Mozilla and some of the work that we've done in India in the policy space over the last sort of couple of years. And then after that, I hand it over to Nikhil to sort of give his talk, and then have a question and answer session where we'll be Yokai will be asking us some questions about what's happening in the Indian technology policy space and what can we do to sort of keep the internet open and accessible as a public resource. So Nikhil Pahwa really, at least for people from India, doesn't really need an introduction. He runs Medianama, a very, very famous portal and probably the preeminent publication that covers technology policy making in the country. He is most known for the Save the Internet campaign, which was the largest grassroots technology campaign arguably in Indian history, where we had millions of people sort of come together and fight for net neutrality. And as a result of that campaign, India has now among the strongest net neutrality laws in the world. And Nikhil was an integral part of that movement. Apart from that, Nikhil is also a TED Fellow, has been named an Indian of Tomorrow by India Today, and is also an Asia 21 leader, and which is why he's in San Francisco with us and as a part of his sort of leadership cohort. Apart from that, Nikhil at Medianama also covers pretty much every single issue in public policy, whether it's digital payments, whether it's competition, whether it's content regulation, whether it's data protection. Medianama is the portal that many of us in India turn to look at technology policy making from what is happening, incisive analysis, as well as trying to serve as a platform for the sort of very diverse stakeholders who are present in the space to sort of convene and have conversations with. Medianama is also known for organizing events on, say, data protection, on intermediary liability that serve as getting industry, civil society, and quite often even government to come onto the same platform and to have conversations which are very, very valuable in the Indian context. And we really sort of think that they're very valuable for a lot of the policy developments that happen in India. Apart from that, I would definitely say that independent of his role in the Save the Internet campaign and the role that he plays in Medianama, Nikhil in many ways has also played a very pivotal role in the growth of technology policy making in India, because as a field and as an area, it can be argued that the net neutrality movement was the first sort of real tipping point when technology policy issues became mainstream in India, and the work that Nikhil did around the Save the Internet campaign was very critical in making that happen, and is in fact now studied all over the world as how to run a good and effective grassroots technology campaign. Nikhil has also been a great ally of Mozilla. Some of the first things that Mozilla did in the policy space in the country evolved around net neutrality. And as a part of that, Nikhil shares history with us and has been a key ally in our fights, not only on net neutrality, but on data protection, on India's identity system, the Aadhaar, as well as more recently on content regulation and many of the other sort of pressing issues in the Indian space. And I think that as Mozilla, in the last about 2 years, that we've been specifically focusing on India as a market, independent of the net neutrality work. We have also looked at data protection, where India is looking at a draft data protection law, and I'm sure Nikhil will talk about that. And we've been a part of the push to make sure that it is as rights respecting as possible and applies to both the government as well as private entities in a manner that upholds user rights on the internet and in the offline world. We also have content regulation, where on intermediary liability, the government is considering fairly onerous regulations that would not only have significant business impact for most intermediaries, which are entities that enjoy safe harbor on the internet, but also lead to tangible sort of restrictions on the freedom of expression as we know it on the internet. And apart from that, of course, among the sort of more bigger issues over the last couple of years in India has definitely been Aadhaar and the identity project, where there was a sort of a very large movement that led to a legal challenge in the Supreme Court in India last year, and that has also sort of shaped the conversation around data protection. Keeping all of these things in mind, I think that what Nikhil will do over his talk is, one, give us sort of a high-level overview of what the technology environment in India is, policy-making environment in India is like, what are the different who are the different players and like sort of stakeholders that are involved, and what are some of the broader issues in which this conversation is currently taking place. And then I think also give us a sense of the direction that it is taking and why it's critical to have, I think, an active, involved sort of digital rights community in fighting for these things in India, because without that, like close over 1 billion people and how they access the internet as we know as a global resource would be tangibly affected. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Nikhil on stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Udbhav, for a very generous introduction. Very happy to be here. I have been a fan of Mozilla's work for many, many years, and not just since the first browser, not just because it was the first browser that I used, but I think there is an alignment for us in terms of what we stand for, which is an open internet, a global internet, and the freedom for all of us to use the internet with as few restrictions as possible, and the internet as an enabler of public good, of public interactions. And at this point in time, what's worrying me is that things might not remain that way in India for very long. But before I get there, I just want to give you a brief overview of how I'm viewing what's shaping the internet right now. So, and how India is responding to it. So if you just take a step back and just for a minute imagine Facebook as a country or Google as a country, right? And imagine, that public policy teams are their foreign offices in different countries. If you look at the business teams are effectively the Ministry of Commerce, so to speak. And because at that scale, the kind of relationships you have with people are essentially the kind of distanced relationships that we have with our governments, and the control and the impact that they have are similar. And in that sense, if you look at one key moment that changed things for the internet, it was the Arab Spring. And at that point in time, you had Twitter and Facebook going to town talking about how they brought democracy to the Middle East. But think of a government and what it does to them. They feel that they can get impacted by something that happens online on these platforms. And as a consequence of that, they start looking at policies that enable their control and enable their control over society through people. And so, during the net neutrality campaign, what we were fighting for was essentially preventing the dominance of Facebook by taking over the internet in India by essentially sucking usage into free basics, and mobile operators essentially looking to do the same. And we've seen the impact of that in various countries, whether it's in Myanmar, it's in the Philippines. And what you really have to, one phrase that came up at that point in time was about digital colonization. And I wasn't very comfortable with the usage of that phrase, but because it was one view in our fight and in our pushback, we kind of let that slide. And I think we're suffering today because we allowed that phrase to sustain and grow, because it seems to have, in a country with as much history with colonization as India, it's just gone deep into the psyche of our bureaucracy. And so if you're a country, what would you do to protect yourself from other countries manipulating your nation, right? And I think the policy changes that are happening in India have to be looked at in that context. And I don't know if you noticed, but just yesterday, Angela Merkel talked about digital sovereignty. And that's something which we've been hearing in India for over a year and a half now. And so that approach of trying to ensure that every nation stays sovereign online, retains control, runs through policies in India. And it's hitting us from multiple directions. And I think it's very dangerous for the global nature of the internet. What's happening in India, if that starts getting replicated in multiple parts of the world. Right now, India is looking at a so-called fourth way of internet regulation. So you've got the US, you've got the EU, you've got China. India is trying to figure out what it's going to do, and there is a sense that what it does is going to then impact countries in Southeast Asia, in Africa. We've already got the largest biometric identity project in the world, and different countries are looking at that. Kenya's got its own. I know the Indian government's spoken with Myanmar, in Nigeria. So there is a tendency for what India is doing as an emerging market, as a developing country, to become a kind of a playbook for other countries to learn from. And that's a very dangerous precedence that India seems to be setting. But if you think about that fear of what large global companies can do to a country, and what other countries can do through them, especially after Cambridge Analytica, India started trying to figure out how it can take control. So one theme that runs through what's happening in India is about thinking of data as a national asset, as a national resource. You've probably heard the phrase "data is the new oil" enough times last year to make you want to throw up. That does happen to me, but it's just that it's so deep in the bureaucracy, this thinking, that they tend to forget that data is a personal asset, in the sense that, and so when you think of data as a national resource, what do? Number one, if you think of it as oil, you try and generate as much of it. So the India's biometric identity project, Aadhaar, and all the systems that are being linked to it, whether it's the electronic health records and the public and the National Health Information Network, whether it is a public credit registry where all financial data is going to be stored, whether it is a fast tag, an RFID tag on each car mandatorily put there and linked to an individual's identity and a driver's license, if it's digitization of every interaction with the government, it's effectively creating data sets on individuals and profiling them. To the extent that I think a couple of weeks ago, there was a police station in one part of Hyderabad that was tweeting photographs of their officers just stopping people on the street and doing facial recognition on them, because, I mean, for them, it's their way of finding out whether this person's a criminal or not, and the probable cause standard doesn't exist in India. So we're seeing a situation where digitization of law enforcement, of data collection, profiling, and essentially generating more data because the government sees it as a resource, is core to what they're doing. The other thing that's happening essentially is that there's this constant fear of foreign companies and international entities operating in India, and there's a push back against them because they view them as colonizers. Now, India's been colonized in the past, and one of the things that happened then was that Indian industry was disabled so that foreign entities could sell to India. The East India Company destroyed India's handloom sector and allowed for British exports to India. So they took cotton and they imported clothes, and they destroyed the local industry so that people had only one means of buying clothes. So if you think about the way the Indian government's viewing data, they're thinking that foreign companies are coming in, collecting data from Indian citizens, and exporting that data, building products, and selling those products to India, and in some cases selling the products to the rest of the world. So there's a consultation that's going on right now about something called, well, the consultation is only private, it's only meeting a few private companies, but it's on something called non-personal data. And the philosophy there is that you're coming, you're testing on our citizens, you're collecting the data, you're building products, and you're selling it back to us. So the government wants to take control of what is effectively intellectual property, which is derived data. If you've got traffic data, let's say Uber and Google have got traffic data on Indian cities, the Indian government believes that that should belong to the country and not to Uber and Google. In case of Amazon, what they're thinking is that Amazon's got granular data on what products are selling in which part of the country. And the government saying, why shouldn't that data be available to Indian merchants? So they're trying to claim ownership of that intellectual property because that's one way for them to weaken the dominance of large platforms. There is a move to localize data. It's already happened in payments. WhatsApp isn't able to launch payments in India because of the localization remit, and there are constant hurdles that are being put in their way. But the idea essentially is to ensure that payments stay within the boundaries of India so that the Indian government has got jurisdiction over the data. And you're increasingly seeing more and more countries talk about data localization in a similar context. So these this mandate to localization serves two purposes. One, they can mandate access to that data once it's localized. And two, law enforcement agencies can force access to that data. Now, law enforcement agencies in India are not under an act of parliament. They are not governed. They're only answerable to the Prime Minister's office, to the Prime Minister and to the President, I guess. But there is no way of regulating their activities today, which is why a privacy law is essential. But if you think about what's going on with all the data collection, the localization of data, and law enforcement access to it, because there's nothing preventing all-out access, we have a surveillance state being created. More data generated, more data captured, more data stored, more data accessed. Right? There is a move to monetize some of this data in national interest. So, in case of some amount of vehicle registration data, both personal information as well as vehicular information, the Indian government sold that to about 141 companies for a small amount of money relatively, but it's this philosophy that we should be able to sell the data that we collect. So the activity that's happening is that personal information is being converted into a public asset and then being privatized. And all of this is happening because there isn't a privacy law in place. And even in the privacy law, when the document came out, it seemed to be geared more towards using data to enable economic activity rather than protect rights. That also explains kind of why the Indian government went to the Supreme Court and argued that privacy isn't a fundamental right. They lost, and at some level their wings have been clipped a bit, but I'm not really sure about how this is going to play out with time, but the direction is clear. The government wants more access to data. The other thing they're doing with data is that they're linking it together. So that there's a program called NatGrid which is being restarted, and that essentially was about connecting public and private databases together for law enforcement access. So the initial plan was 21 databases. Phase 2 has 900 public and private databases connected together for law enforcement access. Now, restrictions, it's not very clear what kind of restrictions are going to be placed, but there's going to be an audit trail for sure. But again, because there is an independent audit of law enforcement activities and especially surveillance, and the audit is happening only within the government, there is no judicial scrutiny of any of this. How do you ensure that someone's watching the watchdog, right? So that's essentially so economic activity and national security are the core of everything. In fact, economic security using data is at the core of international policy as well. So India refused to sign the free data transfer agreement under the DFFT at the G20 that Japan was proposing. India was the one major country to opt out of it, and quite loudly, in fact. because they don't want cross-border data flows to be enabled. They want all the data to stay in India. They also are very, very conscious in their relationship with the US about how that plays out. So MasterCard and Visa have been at the receiving end of payments localization, and even mirroring is not being allowed over there. So fraud detection gets impacted, but even in our Prime Minister's recent meeting with Trump, uh, India and the US did not announce a bilateral trade agreement because of ICT issues. And so data flows are very, very critical to the government because they're viewing all of this as a part of economic security. But what we're seeing more and more of is that there's more national security themes playing into most policies. So it's whether it is demand, it's the usage of biometrics for law enforcement. India's rolling out the largest biometric CCTV project, and also law enforcement usage of biometrics. Many airports are piloting, even railway stations are piloting facial recognition systems for allowing people entry. We believe that the Delhi police has got facial recognition systems in place, and they have a large CCTV network that's being put into place as well. Um, uh, all of this is without a privacy law in place. I'm going to keep saying that because that's on top of our mind right now. Uh, there is also this threat of end-to-end encryption being banned in India because there's a case on intermediary liability protections right now, and what's happening there is that we have WhatsApp, which has end-to-end encryption, um, being asked to bring traceability and help identify the originator of information uh, without breaking or without allegedly breaking encryption. Now, with end-to-end encryption, that's not possible. And so the government is saying that we need traceability, don't harm encryption, but give us traceability. What you do to give us traceability is your problem. If it harms encryption, that's your problem and not ours. So they've been very smart about how they've gone about this. And about I think 3 or 4 years ago, there was a draft encryption policy that was terrible, and in fact, one part of the remit was to put in to ask people to store messages in plain text format so that law enforcement could access them. There was a huge uproar against it at that point in time. Now, the difference between that and breaking encryption through this WhatsApp case is that there's a narrative that was built up for it. So there's a narrative built up around fake news, misinformation, and WhatsApp not helping the government figure out who sent a particular message, and this need for traceability uh, was that rhetoric was used. And I think wherever there's a rhetoric already in place, wherever there's a strong narrative already in place, that's where it's becoming difficult to counter the government. So most of the conversation around encryption in India is around national security and how encryption, according to the government, essentially makes national security activity difficult. I was at a government consultation early in the year, and there were 4 retired Army Lieutenant Generals sitting in the row in front of me, and they said, our soldiers die when a WhatsApp message is sent, and there's a bus with troops in it going around the corner, and there's a blast up ahead. And so I think the statement there was that militancy returned to Kashmir after these OTT apps were launched. And so what the government is essentially trying to say is that we need access to all communications in order to enable national security. The conversation we're not having is about how encryption enables safety. And unfortunately, we've missed that part of creating public awareness. We've missed out on making people conscious of how encryption keeps them safe. And people do care. When there was a recent announcement about WhatsApp taking the NSO group to court, it was primetime news, front page news in India. And what we found was a lot of people were signing up for Signal, and downloads of WhatsApp in India dropped by about 80%. So it does indicate to us that people care about privacy. It's just that we failed in the task of getting the message out to them about how encryption is important for their safety. Right? There is also a move from the government to track social media activity. One interesting thing that's been happening over the last week or two is that a lot of people are moving, of all places, to Mastodon. And I mean, people are moving out of Twitter because Twitter has been censoring free speech activists in India. There's an important lawyer who fights a lot of civil rights cases, Sanjay Hegde. His account was banned on Twitter, and they refused to reinstate it. And just because he had the photograph of someone defying authoritarianism in his Twitter cover page. So he effectively moved to Mastodon, and many of us followed him there. And there are other people I know who've been shadow banned. There are people who have been essentially suspended until they delete a particular tweet, which to my mind didn't seem to be problematic because it was linking out to an article of a legitimate news publication. So there is a lot of there is this sense that people want different spaces, safer spaces online as well, and a lot of the liberal conversations is quickly moving to Mastodon. I think Mastodon's seen a spike in users from India. Just yesterday, a member of parliament joined Mastodon, and I had to go about and verify whether that's truly him or not. But the other part of that court case that WhatsApp is facing is about where it originated from. Someone was getting abused on a Facebook page, and there were threats against him, and he went to the police. Police said, we can't do anything about this because Facebook doesn't give us information. So he went to the court, and the court directed the police to register a case. So they sent a letter to Facebook asking for information, which wasn't in the correct format of asking for information. It didn't go from the right authority, from what I understand. And no information, so the case was closed. So this guy then goes to court asking for national IDs to be linked to social media handles. And that case is now in the Supreme Court, and the government is modifying the intermediary liability rules around traceability for that. But there's also this entire thing about proactive takedowns, where while amending intermediary liability rules, there was a draft put up earlier in the year in January. The government also said that platforms should use technology to proactively take down illegal content. Now, if you just take a step back and look at what all of these moves are doing, effectively India's creating a situation where it has a very different internet from the rest of the world. The intermediary liability rules changes also mandate that platforms with more than 5 million users have to have a local office. India's got 625 million internet connections. 5 million is a tiny number for us, right? And we're probably going to be at 1 billion in the next 5 to 6 years. How many platforms are going to come and register in India? So what option does the Indian government have, or what option do the platforms have? They'll block them out. So if you think about it, there's this balkanization that's taking place where you have you have a different set of rules for intermediaries, you have traceability mandated, you have localization, you have local registration, and entities have no choice but to sign out of India effectively. And that means that we have less access to the global internet, less access to the global community. And I think one major shift that's taken place is how global policy is being made today. So if you think about what's changed since Trump came to power, is that we've moved from largely multilateral decision making to bilateral decisions, right? And this threat that a country's infrastructure might get impacted just because the US might decide to impose sanctions on it are very real. If, let's say, MasterCard and Visa networks were forcibly shut down in India uh, because the US can do that, the entire Indian economy would collapse. And what happened with Android and Huawei was really a signal to different countries that they need to develop their own systems, that they need to build protections. So India's creating its own payment exchanges and payment networks already, but their thing is that if Indian users' data is in international servers and the country imposes sanctions on India, what do we do? If cloud services host all of the data outside of India, what do we do? So it's very, very critical to look at this from a geopolitical perspective, and the how US policy is shaping global policy right now. And different countries have to look at things from a sovereignty perspective about protecting their citizens, protecting their economies. And I'm really afraid that we might not have a global internet, at least from an India perspective, a few years from now. The situation is dire. All the things that I'm talking about have happened in the last year and a half, right? And it's happening at a breakneck speed. We are struggling to keep pace. And regulators are becoming overactive now. So there is, even if you look at intermediaries, right, they're not supposed to be types of intermediaries. It's just a function. If you are just enabling transfer of information from one person to the other, you're an intermediary. But there is functional regulation coming in to control the activities of different types of intermediaries. So whether it is payments aggregators and payment gateways are being regulated differently from e-commerce aggregators being regulated differently. And so apart from just localization issues and there is this move to verticalize the internet because that's the traditional nature of governance. If your entire country is digitizing rapidly, every government department thinks about what its role is in the future. So if there isn't a regulation for e-commerce um, intermediaries that is separate, what does the Ministry of Commerce look to? What is its main remit going forward? What does the Ministry of Finance do? What does the Ministry of Road Transport do if it doesn't regulate an Uber, which is allegedly a transport intermediary, right? So I think intermediary liability protections are under serious threat, not just from a safety and security perspective, from a traceability perspective, or a content takedown perspective. I think the very definition of intermediaries is going to change. How it's going to change is something we don't know. But that verticalization means that the shape-shifting nature of the internet, where one company can when you start a product, it doesn't work, it becomes something else over a period of time, that might eventually get restricted to what rules you are governed by as a company rather than as a function. Um, the other thing that's happening is which is very worrying for us is that domestic companies are using these things to push back from a comparative perspective against global entities. So you've had people demanding localization, saying that keys to encryption should be given to the government so that messages can be traced. And they're saying that we have different kind of regulations and rules that we are governed by because we are registered locally. So for example, Make My Trip, which is India's largest travel site, argues that booking.com uses a different kind of payment gateway, so it's easier and it's cheaper for people to book hotel rooms using booking.com versus Make My Trip. And they're losing money because they have to discount as much and yet pay taxes. Right? So taxation is a major issue as well. So bit by bit, I think regulation is changing to bring either bring the internet in or restrict it to what it is to local entities. And so I know India is looking at something different from China, but directionally it looks pretty much the same. And that's also coming in from a content regulation perspective. So we've just had, in line with restrictions in print media, there's a 26% limit to foreign direct investment in print media in India. Uh, we've just had an announcement that the same limit is being extended to online news entities. Now, what does that do to the New York Times website, which has got, I'm sure, more than 26%, foreign investment, which is non-Indian investment? What if it's accessed in India, and it is? Will it be blocked? So these regulations still aren't defined. So we'll get to know more about it. But there's also content regulation from a Netflix perspective. There are certain entities that have gone to court saying that they have content which is not necessarily in aligned with Indian culture. That there is smoking and nudity and drinking in many of these shows, even though it's private viewing by adults. And the Indian government is considering guidelines that these platforms ought to follow. There is broadly, I think if I look at the next year, we're going to see more segmented regulation of platforms. We're probably going to see data localization being expanded. We're going to see regulation in terms of protecting children online. That's my sense. Most importantly, we have a deadline. That deadline is 15th of January for amendments to safe harbor, amendments to the intermediary liability protections in India. And I think that's probably going to be the defining moment for internet regulation in the country. I know I've gone on for quite a bit, but any questions, anything that I can tell you more about? Thank you. Right behind you.
Cool. Great. So just as we get into Q&A, so we'll be taking questions on the policy discussion Slack. So please jump in there, and I'll hand over to Mika.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for the talk. One of the things that I was thinking about is sort of when it comes to protectionist policies in any country, on the economic side, I think there's a lot of general consensus that often protectionist policies lead to increased costs from the domestic industries. And so I'm wondering, is there active voices from Indian companies to speak out and say, actually, this is going to harm us? You mentioned one example with the Make My Trip. And what is it that is causing companies to not feel comfortable enough and say, actually, this is going to harm us, Indian, your whole end goal is for increased economic activity, but this could draw back local businesses as well.
So it's going to draw back it's going to draw back investment in India as well, because if you're constantly under attack, you're probably going to sign out of that market. Many companies are now looking at Indonesia over India, and is what I hear as a growing market. But Indian companies, to be honest, I don't think they've really thought this through. So, for example, there's a company called ShareChat which keeps pushing for protectionist policies against TikTok, because they're purely viewing this from a competitive point of view rather than how it's going to impact their costs. And that happens when you are a moderately dominant player in the market, where you're, let's say, a number 2 or a number 3, and you want to use policies to push back against others. So it's happening in payments, where Google Pay came in and just blew almost everyone else out of the water. And when WhatsApp Pay was about to launch, the CEO and the founder of one of India's largest payment companies that rode the initial wave, called Paytm, he went on TV and started calling Facebook an evil corporation, and this is going to be a moment of colonization for India, because WhatsApp Pay's interface was just so intuitive. Unfortunately, they launched in beta, and this payment regulation for data localization came in while they were in beta, and they haven't been able to expand the product and do a formal launch. But really, I think most Indian companies aren't looking at it from a costs perspective. They're only looking at it from a comparative framework. The other thing is that most startups in India are too busy trying to survive to think about how policy might kill them. And I think that's one space where we have failed to get more voices in. But it's not an easy market. It's a highly competitive market right now. And this pushback started, I think, about 3 years ago, where there was first talk about capital dumping. So India's largest taxi ride-hailing company, Ola, talked about capital dumping from Uber. Flipkart at that time talked about capital dumping from Amazon. It's another thing that Flipkart has stopped saying these things after they were bought by Walmart. But there's also it's like these companies don't want foreign competition to have it easy in the market, but they're open to them buying them out.
Thanks for that, Nikhil. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in through Slack. So what do you think is the biggest thing that Western companies misunderstand about India?
I think, so I don't really have I would say that they tend to think of India as one market. The fact is that it's an extremely diverse market with different sets of users. The English-speaking population is relatively tiny. And so there's a lot of adaptation that's required for the Indian market from a product perspective, but also about how strong policy making is right now, and how in terms of the lack of consultation and the impact that policy in India can have on the region around it is something that's also underestimated. I don't know if I've answered that question, but
I think that's useful.
okay.
So I've got one follow-up question in that same vein, and then we'll go back out to other commons if there's anyone who has a question. So start thinking about that. What are the ways in which growing distrust between foreign players and the Indian government can be improved?
So so I'll give you an example, right, of how bad it is first. There were folks from while the DFFT agreement was being discussed before the G20 summit, specifically on e-commerce, the Ministry of Commerce held a meeting, 2 meetings in a particular day. The first meeting was separately with Indian companies, and we reported on this stuff. So I'd spoken to some 17 sources across 2 meetings there, and in that meeting, one person actually got up and said that you can't trust foreign companies. Right? So essentially, there is a very strong movement pushing back against foreign companies. Now, in the next meeting, when the foreign companies came in, the minister looked at these guys, and all of them were Indians, but working with foreign companies. He looks at them and says, I know all of you are working with MNCs, but I hope in your heart you're Indian. And we have to do what is necessary for the future of India. In the same meeting, he also said that it's okay if we get a few $1 billion less of investment, but we have to think about the future of India. I think what we have failed to do, and what foreign companies have also failed to do, is highlight the benefits of India's access to an open internet, or highlight the benefits that foreign company participation has brought to Indian users. I mean, let's face it, most of the work around Indian language tech in India has been done by Google, and they've been at it since 2005, 2006, at a time when no one cared really to look into these things. There were a few small companies, but most of them didn't survive. Google's done it at scale. So that emphasis that India benefits more from global participation, both in terms of investment, which I think has been reiterated enough, but also the fact of the value that a global internet, and how an app that might be started in Mexico might be beneficial to someone in India. That kind of a pitch, not just from foreign companies, but also from civil society, from non-profit organizations. I don't think that's come in yet. And I think that needs to be, just like the conversation around encryption needs to shift from security to safety. I think the conversation around having an open internet needs to emphasize the fact that has benefited from an open internet.
Thanks. Do you have any questions from any of the other commons? I'm seeing no one jump up at mics, so I'll keep going with Slack questions. India has been debating a data protection law for some time. What do you think can be done to increase the pressure on the government to actually introduce and pass this law?
I think the data protection law, from what we've heard, is held up because law enforcement wants, or because of two things. One, law enforcement wants to be exempted from it because they believe that if they can't get access to data without restrictions, then they won't be able to investigate things properly. And law enforcement requires better training for sure in India. But I think the other thing that's held it up, from what we hear, is this debate around non-personal data. So we hope that the data protection law is going to be introduced in December, but I'm hearing murmurs that it may not. And if it doesn't get introduced in December, then it's probably going to be August next year. So it's going to be a long wait. We were expecting it in this August, but it got delayed. And let's face it, given that so many things like facial recognition systems, NatGrid, all of these things are being rolled out without a data protection law in place, I'm not sure if the government really wants a law. It just is forced to have a law in place by the Supreme Court. So it's open to delaying it. I don't see why they won't.
Cool. I'm going to give maybe a word of context before the next question. So UC Browser is a browser that's made by the Chinese Alibaba Group. We spend a bunch of time thinking about some of our competitors like Chrome and Edge and so forth, but in many parts of the world, including India, UC Browser is incredibly popular. I believe that UC Browser is the most popular browser in India at the moment. What do you think has led to UC Browser's success in the Indian market?
So I think Chrome is the most popular browser again. UC Browser was there for a while. But what really changed for India, and I think you have to take into context what India was like 5 years ago, before Jio launch and before the net neutrality campaign. Most of the internet access was on slow connections, and it was really expensive. Just for context, since then, data costs, I think, 1/20th of what they used to be. So I would probably be paying about 10 cents per GB. And my data plan would be, I think there are data plans that offer users either 1 GB per day. Some data plans offer users 2 GB per day. And at 4G speeds, which are effectively, to be honest, they're more like 3G speeds. But data costs have come down, data consumption has shot up. Now, the environment in which UC Browser was popular was the same environment that I guess Firefox Lite is trying to address, which is expensive data costs and low speeds. We don't have that problem in India anymore. So I'm hoping that my favorite browser, which is Firefox Focus, is going to become more popular going forward.
Cool, that's super insightful. Looks like we have a question from the audience.
So actually, just yesterday, I heard someone say, I think on group chat there should be more access for government, because on group chats, that's where fake news and terrorism spreads. Like, this is a person who I would think liberal person, but I think that's where the examples come in, as you mentioned. We don't do a good enough job of explaining good examples of how security is beneficial. So I'm wondering, what are some, in the Indian context, examples of how security is beneficial for, whether it's an encryption or whatnot, when people are talking about it in this way? Oh yes, national security is an issue. We should give up an exchange. So how is security good in the Indian context? And then also examples of how the government has gone too far with surveillance or the lack of restrictions. And that is why restrictions on the watchdog are also very powerful and necessary, again, in the Indian context.
So I think the example is that the number of people who started logging in on Signal immediately after the NSO hack was discovered indicates that people do care about they care about privacy and they care about the trust in their communications. I think trust is a key example to give. That you may not be saying something which is necessarily problematic, and the people who don't really think much about this stuff come and say that if you have nothing to hide, why should you worry? That's the common rhetoric that I've heard. And my response to them is always that it's about trust. Would you want me reading your entire, would you want me to get access to your email? If not, then why would you want the government to get access to your messages? Why do you assume that the government is not going to maliciously target some people? And it's important for democracy, it's important for journalists to protect their sources, to have encryption. Most politicians use WhatsApp today. Many politicians signed into Signal after the NSO hack was discovered. I think these issues are a lot more complex. When it comes to misinformation, to my mind, I think WhatsApp did a pretty good job of addressing it. Unfortunately, they did it really late. Like the first instance of, India had 146 internet shutdowns last year. I would say that a majority of them are attributed to misinformation being spread on WhatsApp. In groups, there were, I think 2 years ago, there was a fake video that was being sent about children being kidnapped. And that video has been customized to different regions to suggest to people that it was their town where children were being kidnapped. There was a video of 2 men on a bike coming and picking people up. 29 people got killed because mobs saw strangers in their village or their town and were afraid that children would be kidnapped, right? So this is a real problem. Internet shutdowns happening because of these things. And to my mind, even at that time, I used to think that some amount of traceability is necessary because it's a legitimate problem. What WhatsApp has done, especially leading up to the elections, and I say it's late because the first riot that was instigated by using videos on WhatsApp was in 2013, the first riot in India. And the internet shutdowns largely started increasing after that because the cops were afraid of what might happen in what part of the country. So what WhatsApp has done is they've reduced the number of people you can forward a message to. Forwarded messages are marked as forwarded now. And I think they're also considering putting number counts. There are groups where where administrators, I think, are being given more power. Users can prevent themselves from being added to groups if they want. Does this fix the problem? No, it doesn't. But does it affect the virality and the velocity of information being spread? It does. It's not an easy task to figure out, what's the right way of doing this. But I would say that it's about proportionality. And so you can't make people more secure by making them more vulnerable. And, removing end-to-end encryption or giving government access to all group chats makes people vulnerable. And security forces use encrypted platforms. So I'd stick with that you have to have proportionality and you can't impose vulnerability on everyone to secure a few instances. And your policing mechanisms have to improve. Yes, it's tricky to go from hop to hop on a WhatsApp, on WhatsApp to try and figure out who created that message originally. But when has access to information also prevented attacks and issues? We hear about many instances where they haven't acted quickly enough. There is no easy answer to this question, but I think proportionality is probably it.
What is your sense of Mozilla's work in India, and what can we be doing better to keep the internet open and accessible?
I think Mozilla has done exceptional work, especially since Yochai and I connected over net neutrality. Very, very helpful during the campaign. The Mozilla community was extremely helpful at that point in time, a very loud voice. I think the voices need to become louder. One thing that I would really want is for Mozilla to facilitate more expert commentary in India. So if we have researchers and academics from different universities in the world giving a point of view that counters some of the incorrect perceptions or even incorrect submissions to court in India, that would be great. I'd like to see, to be honest, on this encryption and end-to-end encryption issue, I'd like to see Mozilla go to court in India. I think we need voices of entities that fight for an open, free, global internet to be more powerful and more active, and also galvanize their communities towards action. I know advocacy might be a bit difficult to do in India, but we do need more expert representation. Look, I think the Indian government thinks very highly of Mozilla. They see them as a neutral entity that cares about the internet, which is what it is, and not as, a company with vested interests like a Facebook or a Google is, right? And so I think that needs to be utilized, that needs to be used to make a case for the open internet, about talking about the benefits of an open. The World Wide Web Foundation used to be fairly active, and I think one of the things that they did during net neutrality and in a few instances subsequently was that they identified and highlighted the principles of an open internet in every submission and said, please keep these in mind when you are making policy. And so quite often in battling over nuanced issues and contesting some of these things, I think we tend not to push very strongly on the principles that we stand for. And I would say not just Mozilla. I think for me, WhatsApp as a company has, and not Facebook, but WhatsApp as a company has stood for privacy and the safety of users in using their platform. And I think they need to highlight those principles as well. We need more voices from across the globe participating in India, because policy that's made in isolation is going to be bad policy. Policy that only looks at Indian interests and not the global internet's contribution to India and India's contribution to the open internet is going to mean that there's probably going to be some sort of gap that exists between a global internet and an Indian internet, and we want to keep that to as small as possible.
Cool. I think that's about all we have time for, so please join me in thanking Nikhil for a wonderful talk and spending time with us.
Thank you. One little thing, I've given Yochai a bunch of these. This is a quick snapshot of everything that's happening in India and what we've been dealing with. Most of it I talked about, so if you want a copy of this, please take it.
So we have a few of those here in the SFO Commons. We will talk with Nikhil and see if we can get a soft copy, which, assuming Nikhil says yes to, we will post on the policy discussion Slack, or you can email Udbhav or myself. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.